Grace and peace be with you on this day.
And also with you.
The passage this morning, as I said earlier, is found only in the Gospel of Matthew. And Jesus tells this parable of the laborers of the vineyard in response to Peter's question. Peter wanted to know if he would be rewarded for all the work that he has put in. And Jesus replied with this parable, and he says that it's a description of the kingdom of heaven. Just those words alone warrant for us to go through this parable very, very carefully. So let's begin with the beginning, the first sentence. The kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who goes out to hire workers for the vineyard. There's a lot in this first sentence. And I have to ask, and I would just out of curiosity raise your hand. Has anyone here ever done any farm work? You've raised and picked crops. Okay, there's a few people. Anybody inquire? Okay, all right. They could tell you that it's not easy work. It's hot, uncomfortable, possibly even painful. Many people who work in the fields have perpetual pains in their back, their neck, and in their joints, in their hands. It all depends which crop they're picking. But in this passage, there's even an added stressor, and that it's the harvest. When it's harvest, that means that the work must get done, and it must get done soon, or else the fruit of the vine will go bad. So this is the context. This is what's happening, and the landowner's going out to call workers, and the workers know exactly that it's harvest time. And the landowner goes out to call people to do this work, knowing that it's hard work. But that is the first action in the parable. The landowner goes out. In other words, he's not waiting for people to come to him. The landowner goes to where the people are. He goes among the people. And from there, he calls for the workers. And the workers have free will. They have to respond. They have to stand up and say, here I am. I'm ready. Take me. And then what happened to those people who didn't step forward? Well, they get a chance. They get a chance to rethink it, and later on in the day, to come and step up again. The landowner goes repeatedly to the marketplace. But there's still some people who don't say yes. There's still some people who stay behind, and they say, man, that's hard work. I don't want to work that hard. So, what's the first requirement to get into the kingdom of heaven? And that is to answer the call. To be able to step forward and say, I'm ready and willing and able to do this work. As hard as it might be, you can count on me. My friends, as a pastor, I spend too much of my time helping people discern God's call. And I have to tell you that through the years, and I've been at this now, I'm going on 27. Through the years, I have found that every story is different. Every person is different. That all their experiences are different. But they tend to, speaking in general, they tend to have something in common. And that is when God is calling them, they're confused. They're confused. They don't know what to make of it. And they come and they speak with me to kind of like to affirm, is this what I think it is? Could this be true? And I have to always stand back and smile and say, hey, this is good news. God is calling you. Another portion of my ministry has been to help people find the courage to answer God's call. The parable begins with people there. They hear it, and they have the courage, and they step forward, and they're going. So this parable is not about discerning God's call. This parable is about what do you do with the call once you've answered it? How do you respond? How do you live it? So the parable continues after this first prerequisite is fulfilled. And the landowner found workers for his harvest. But then at the end of the day, it just so happened that the pay was not proportionate. Those who worked the least received the same pay as those who worked the most. I was actually very pleased to see young Micah. Nancy, you got to be so proud. Your grandchild there. He did Bible study, good Sunday school there at his hometown. But for how many of us would not have answered like Micah did? How many of us would know that, wait a second, I clocked in at sunrise, I clocked out at sunset, and you're going to give me the same pay as some person who only worked for an hour? I think not. There seems to be an injustice. Why is the landowner being generous to those who walked onto the field at the very last hour? Why does Jesus use this example of disproportionate pay to describe the kingdom of heaven? Is this how God is to be understood, as unfair? So what image do you get of God in this parable? I'm fortunate to have spent some time out in the fields with farm workers. And the image that I have of God, especially for this parable, comes from the experiences that I had with farm workers. And I kind of want to share those experiences with you because, first of all, I think they're rather unique. But it also might help you explain the focus of this sermon. When I lived in South Florida, a significant portion of my ministry was with my church that also had a ministry with farm workers. Over the 18 years that I was there, we would go to farm workers in Homestead and in other parts of the state of Florida and help them in their labor disputes for better pay and better working conditions. Now, most of us, and when I say us, I mean urban and suburban consumers like me, we usually don't get to meet the people who pick our tomatoes, our apples, oranges, and strawberries. We go to the grocery store and we see these fruits displayed. They're nicely packaged. And many times we have no clue how much work it took to get them from the land to the store. You may know this already, so I'm going to ask for your patience as I briefly describe the economic injustice that plagues farm workers nationwide and here in Florida. An injustice that not only exploits them economically, but many of them suffer bodily harm from pesticides and chemical exposure. Since the 1950s, farm workers have been fighting for safer working conditions and better pay. And in time, over the years, after many good people got organized, many of these good people, by the way, were church folk, the working conditions of farm workers improved. Enough. They improved a bit. There's still a lot more to go. But there has been progress. And I will tell you that nobody that I know would choose to be a farm worker, because nobody that I know would tolerate the abuse. Now, I'm grateful for the ministry that I had along the farm workers. I have to tell you, it opened my eyes to the hard realities as to how food is farmed. So don't be surprised if we're ever at a meal together and I say grace, and in my grace, I say that I'm grateful for the many hands that were part of the process of bringing the food to our table. So enough of that historical background. Let's go back to my illustration. The year was about 2004. I'm almost 20 years younger than I am today. And I lived in South Florida with my church, and I led a ministry for people who worked at a palm tree farm. Palm trees are farmed. And in those palm tree farms, you really can't see much because palm trees grow way beyond 6 feet tall. And in Homestead, there is a palm tree farm called Manuel Diaz Farms. You could Google it, and they will still come up. They're still around. They own over hundreds of thousands of palm trees. Chances are, when you drive through the turnpike and through other public space that's been decorated with palm trees, that those palm trees came from Homestead, Florida, and the Manuel Diaz Farms. He got a sweet deal. He got a sweet deal with the government. And so on this particular day, I was in the field walking with several other farm workers who were trying to get organized. And we were going along the rows of the palm trees when all of a sudden there was this whistle, this very, very, very distinct whistle. It was the boss man calling the workers. And everyone stopped. There was this silence and this stillness. Everyone stopped. And then one person who was walking with us, he was almost like the designated leader. He went ahead and faced the sky and he went, "Mande!" Mande is a Spanish word that the English equivalent is mandate or to command. It also means to send, by the way. It's one of those interesting double meaning words. In its daily use among Central Americans, it kind of just says, "Hey, I'm here. I'm waiting for you to tell me what it is that you want." So if you're at a Mexican restaurant and all of a sudden you hear the server say to the client, "Mande," it means like, yeah, go ahead, tell me, what do you want to eat? I'm waiting for you to say your order. And then after that worker went ahead and said that word out into the sky, and clearly saying, "I'm waiting for your mandate." Then there was a 3-part whistle, 3 short whistles that blew out. And in their way of communicating with each other, 3 short blasts of a whistle meant to gather at the trailer. If you're going to communicate with me, please send me a text. Don't whistle at me. But out there in the field, that's what works. Out there in the field where you can't see what's going on and reception is low and who knows who has a cell phone, that was actually the best way to communicate, and it made a lot of sense. And so when the whistle blew and there was this 2-syllable word as a reply, "I'm here, listening for your order," I have to tell you that I wasn't surprised to see everybody all of a sudden drop what they're doing and start walking. And in unison, they gathered around this trailer. And there was this tall, large-framed man whose blue eyes, white skin, and pink blotches revealed that he was not an immigrant laborer. To my surprise, he spoke to them in Spanish. Mind you, he had a very thick accent, but it was Spanish nonetheless, Spanish that they could all understand. And then, again, to my surprise, he had an affectionate tone about him. He spoke to all the laborers with this very, very, very soft, affectionate way that was very, very respectful. And he knew the workers by name. They weren't just, nameless people walking by. He knew them all by name. And they, in turn, as workers, accepted his authority with respect. Now, there's something I want to share. This is the observable impression, the kind of thing that you could only get when you're there at the moment and as you're watching all this thing. I'm clearly the outsider. And the impression I got is that all these laborers, including the boss man, were humble. They respected the authority before them and they listened with humility. I didn't see anybody with a bad attitude. And that kind of surprised me because how many people do we know that when in the midst of doing hard work, the sweat, the heat, the pain, the hard work, whatever, they become short-tempered, and they displace their anger on the person whom they think is responsible for their grievance. That was not the case here. That was not the case. Nobody had an attitude. And then I witnessed how the boss man cared for one of the workers, a pregnant woman. She was limping, and he asked her about her limp. And she replied that it was nothing, and then she kind of looked down, almost in shame. But he persisted. And she finally stated that it was her shoes. It was her shoes that were causing her limp. So he went and he turned to his assistant, and he instructed the assistant to go ahead and get her some new shoes. Now, the woman did not get a chance to go shopping for new shoes. She didn't leave the field. She kept on working with everyone else, and there's a very practical reason for that. And that is that she needed her pay for the day. Had she left, she would have lost her full day's wages, which would have been $40. Just put that in there, right? Think how much she's actually making per hour in order to get $40. And then the shoes were brought to her. I don't know, if they just have a bunch of shoes laying around. I have no story about the shoes, but I do know that the shoes were brought to her. And so I just had to ask the workers that were organized about their relationship with the boss man. And they told me that they have no quarrel with him. They said that their quarrel is with the men and the women who sit around corporate tables making decisions without ever having stepped foot on the field. They said that the boss man was clearly not one of them, but they still recognized that he too was a victim of the system. Even though he was higher up in the ladder, he was still a victim of the system. And this is where I get my image of the landowner in the parable. I'm not talking about the white skin and the blue eyes. I'm talking about the affectionate, respectful tone and the authority, making it clear that he's not one of the workers, but yet he knows them all by name. And this is why this parable works so well to describe the kingdom of heaven. God is clearly not one of us until the person of Jesus is made known to us. And then God knows us by name. And God has a call. God calls out to us, and it's a call that must be answered. And when I hear that call, I want to be just like a field hand. And I want to look up into the sky and say, Monday! I'm here, listening for your order. And then I want to stand before God, and I want to stand with humility, granting him authority over my life. But what about the disproportionate pay? Because that's what the parable is really about. What about this unwarranted generosity? I've been working my whole life to live and promote this faith. Why should a person who's late to the game, late to the work, get as much recognition as me? And the parable gives us the answer. The parable gives us the answer in 2 words. Why not? That's how God operates. Who am I to tell God how God is to give God's blessings? It all goes back to the humility. If I am truly humble, I will accept God's authority. I was talking to Susan McKenzie after she heard this sermon, and she said, I finally understand now deathbed confessions. Deathbed confessions, it's the last minute. It's the last minute before the person goes, and it is at this minute that the person can be given the same reward as those of us who've been working the whole life. But it's more than just accepting God's authority. I want to take it deeper. I think that it's more than just about being humble. It's about accepting that God will distribute in the way that God sees fit. But Jesus gives us another layer to that. Jesus told us in his great commandment not to accept God. He said to love one another. Think about the focus of Jesus was not so much to get us to become obedient to God, but to get us to be loving towards one another. And why? Well, because it is through that action of love that we actually get to express the nature of God. To know God's love is to face a moment of disproportionate pay with joy. To know God's love is to be happy for the latecomer and say to that person, how wonderful that you got paid as much as I did. Humility, to accept the authority, and joy as we understand how God's love works. Now, I don't know about you, but I think that there are just way too many people around us nowadays who are neither humble nor joyful. I want to tell you about a few months ago, I was talking to a young person who was having difficulty with his roommate. He had moved into an apartment and had sharing all the costs with another young man. And then this young person was resentful, indignant, downright angry about the behavior of his roommate. Behavior that he thought was intentionally wrong. So I'm sitting there as a pastor, I'm listening to this person with so much passion tell me how is it that he has been wronged. And I'm waiting for something huge. I'm waiting for something that's criminal, unethical. And all of a sudden I realize, you're just young. You haven't been around, have you? This person hasn't even had an older brother to pick on him. I sat there and said, oh my God, what a sheltered life this individual had. But I got to tell you, my pastor filter was on, so I just looked at him with my pastoral face, and I said, oh yes, that must have felt terrible. But inside, I'm thinking to myself, wow, you are extra sensitive, aren't you? But worse than that, he was rather judgmental too. And eventually, this young person quieted down. A young person quieted down, and I sat there, and I had a moment of silence with him. And I could tell it was actually the first moment of silence anybody had had with him. He was uncomfortable with it. And I could tell that he wanted to reach for his phone and start looking through his phone. There's a silence. There's nothing to do. I should be scrolling through my phone. But I just sat there and I looked at him, and then I asked him this question. I said, have you ever heard of the word grace? And the young person nodded. And I said, what do you think it means? And then he had this truly adolescent answer, and he said, I don't know. So I told him, grace is unmerited forgiveness. A forgiveness and an acceptance that is given not because the person did something to earn it, but because God loves. Grace keeps no record of wrong. It does not measure our value by the quantity of things that we have accumulated. It does not measure our worth by the things that we have done, but rather, grace looks at the potential of who we can be and the transformation that might follow. In other words, when we are recipients of grace, it does something to us. It changes us because we realize we are getting more than we deserve. We thank God we're not getting what we deserve. And then here we are receiving grace. And there, by the grace of God, go I, you have heard. Haven't you? And so therefore, there's this transformation that happens when we receive grace. And that tells us that the purpose of grace is to change the recipient. To change the person with love, not with punishment. To change the person in a manner that stimulates joy and not resentment. So then I had to take this young person by the hand with affection and authority. And I had to ask this young person, are you so perfect? Stop focusing on the fault of others and work on yourself. Extend some grace today because you'll never know if you yourself might need some grace tomorrow. It kind of lines up with another biblical passage of Jesus that says, you're looking at the speck in my eye, but you don't see the plank in yours. So what about us? What about us here at Pass-A-Grille Beach Community Church? Have we heard of grace? How many of us are crying about how we have been wronged? How many of us are demanding satisfaction? And how many of us have learned to accept with humility? How many of us have taken a step further and praised God joyfully for the generosity that is shown to others? There's a lot to unpack here. There's a lot to reflect on. But none of it can begin until we take that very first step. We got to take that first step that's in the first sentence of the parable, and that is that we have to answer the call loud and clear. When God's call comes to us, may we look up at the sky and say, Mande, I am here, waiting and listening for your order. Amen.